Thank you. Over the past couple of days, you've heard some amazing perspectives on exploring how Brazil can leapfrog into the exponential age. And now we're in the process of wrapping up 2 days of very rich material. I'm going to step back for a moment and focus on something that I think is an important paradox, a paradox of this exponential age. As was mentioned, I run a research center called the Center for the Edge, and we've been exploring what we call the big shift, the long-term forces that are reshaping the global economy. And we see an interesting paradox. On the one side, these forces are creating exponentially expanding opportunity. There's no question that the opportunity would have been unimaginable 10, 20, 30 years ago. But at the same time that we have that exponentially expanding opportunity, we are also confronting mounting performance pressure on all of us, as individuals and as institutions. At the level of institutions, the pressure takes many different forms. The impact of all this digital technology has been to significantly and substantially reduce barriers to entry and barriers to movement on a global scale. Competition is intensifying. At the same time, the pace of change is accelerating. We're finding that product life cycles are compressing. It used to be if you had a successful new product and got it into market, you could declare victory. Now the question is, what's next? And how soon can you get that into the market? And then, as if that weren't enough, all this connectivity we've created on a global scale means that some tiny event in a small, faraway place in the world can quickly cascade into an extreme event that disrupts our best laid plans and projections and leaves us scrambling to figure out what to do. That's a lot of pressure. Intensifying competition, accelerating change, disruptive events. What's been our reaction to that mounting pressure? As human beings, we have a very natural reaction to all of that. Completely understandable. On the one side, we tend to become more risk averse. We see all the risk and we don't see the opportunity or reward. We tend to shrink our time horizons. We're so focused on the pressure of the moment that we can't afford to spend time thinking long term. We've got to focus on today. And because we're focused on today, and it's a given as to what the resources are today, it becomes a win-lose situation. Either I'm going to get those resources, or you're going to get them. And so trust erodes. You may look like a really nice person, but at the end of the day, I know only one of us is getting these resources. It better be me. So again, totally understandable human reactions to mounting performance pressure. But ultimately, very dysfunctional and representing barriers to addressing the expanding opportunities. If we have that mindset, we're going to have a hard time moving aggressively to address the opportunities. So what do we need to do? How do we address this natural reaction to mounting pressure? Well, you start by expanding your horizons. And in the brief time that I have today, I'm going to focus on 3 horizons. One is look ahead. The other is look around, and the other is look within. Expand horizons on all 3 of those dimensions. And as I hope to show you, they are all connected and can reinforce each other. Let me start with look ahead. What I mean by this is looking out into the future. And again, this is a bit of a paradox because as the future becomes more and more turbulent and uncertain, having a sense of direction becomes more and more critical. And so we've become big proponents of a very different approach to strategy. that we think is required to succeed in this kind of mounting pressure. It's what we call the zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy. It focuses on two different time horizons in parallel. One time horizon, 10 to 20 years. And on that horizon, the questions are, what is our relevant market or industry going to look like 10 to 20 years from now? And then what are the implications for the kind of business or operations we need to have 10 to 20 years from now? And what's the big opportunity that's out there that we could target? That's the zoom out, 10 to 20 years. Zoom in, very different horizon, 6 to 12 months. And on that horizon, the questions are, what are the 2 or 3 things that we could do in the next 6 to 12 months that would accelerate, have the greatest ability to accelerate our movement towards that longer-term destination? And do we have a critical mass of resource against those 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? 2 horizons, 10 to 20 years, look ahead, and then the 6 to 12 month horizon, the zoom in horizon. Interesting contrast. Where do most traditional organizations spend their time on strategy? It's the 5-year plan. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. That's our strategy. Well, it's an interesting observation. The companies that pursue the strategy I'm talking about, zoom out, zoom in, and they're some of the most successful tech companies in Silicon Valley, pay very little attention to 1 to 5 years. Their entire focus is on 10 to 20 years or 6 to 12 months. They're constantly challenging themselves to look ahead. And part of the reason the 10 to 20 year horizon becomes so effective and powerful is because if you just take a 5-year time horizon, you can pretty much convince yourself you're going to be the same company or business that you are today 5 years from now. Maybe some minor changes on the margin, but same business. If you truly understand exponential change and you look out 10 to 20 years and you believe you're going to be the same business that you're in today, you don't understand exponential change. Go back to the table. It forces leadership out of their comfort zone and gets them to address some of the most basic assumptions about what business are we really in? What business should we be in? And can be very powerful, that looking ahead to have a sense of direction. And it also addresses one of the big challenges that I hear all the time when I talk to companies around the world, the very large companies, is the complaint that we're spread way too thin. We have so many things going on, and nothing has critical mass of attention or resource, so we're getting no impact. This forces focus. It says at the end of the day, we need to align and commit to 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months, based on that looking ahead, that will accelerate our movement towards that destination. So that's looking ahead. I'll just give you a quick example of a company. Most companies who pursue this don't talk about it in public, but there's one company where it's been written about, and so I can share it. It was a small startup in Redmond, Washington in the United States back in the mid-1970s. It was a company called Microsoft. Bill Gates pursued a zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy. And his zoom out view, his looking ahead in the computer industry, could be summarized in 2 sentences back in the mid-1970s. 1, computing is moving from centralized mainframes to the desktop. 2, if you want to be a leader in the computer industry, you have to be a leader on the desktop. It wasn't a detailed blueprint of the computer industry and what it was going to look like 10 to 20 years from now, but it was enough detail so that he could make key choices in the near term that would accelerate his movement towards that longer term destination. And looking back, we would say, well, of course, that's obvious, but at the time that he articulated the zoom out view, it was very controversial. Most people challenged it and disagreed with it. But he stayed true to it, and it lasted for a good 20 years, drove the initial success of Microsoft. So looking ahead, we believe, is key in a world of mounting performance pressure. It's to get out there and have a sense of direction and destination. What is the big opportunity that you could be targeting and moving towards? So that's looking ahead. Another way of expanding horizons is looking around. And in this context, what I'm focused on is identifying third parties around you that you could mobilize to help you address that opportunity out in the future. One of the big mistakes we find in traditional companies is a tendency, once they see a big opportunity, to want to do it all themselves, particularly if you're a large company. Our belief is that one of the key elements of this expanding opportunity that we're talking about is the notion of leverage. It's the notion of not having to do it all yourself and to being able to get more and more resources from third parties to accelerate your movement towards that longer-term opportunity. In this context, I think one of the big untapped opportunities for companies is in growth strategy. I participate in a lot of growth strategy discussions, and typically the discussion falls into two choices: make or buy. The only two ways to grow are either to make a big acquisition or make it yourself. Our belief is there's a third path to growth that is becoming more and more feasible, and we believe more and more necessary, which is leveraged growth. How can you identify and mobilize and connect more and more third parties to add value to your customers where you can capture some of that value for yourself and not go out and make the acquisitions and not develop it internally, but mobilize? So leverage growth, big opportunity that's not being tapped. But if you look around, it is a very big opportunity. Another opportunity around leverage is what we call shaping strategies. Again, in a time of rapid change, we have a tendency to fall into what I describe as reactive strategies. The winning strategy is to sense and respond as quickly as you can to whatever is going on out there. That's the way to go forward. What that misses is that in times of rapid change, there are more degrees of freedom to entirely restructure markets and industries. Not take it as a given, but restructure the market or industry in a fundamental way, and do it by mobilizing more and more third parties to support that shaping strategy. We've studied successful shapers throughout history, and one of the interesting things is it's a highly leveraged form of strategy. At the end of the day, the shaper, the company that's shaping, is actually investing a very small portion, maybe 5% of the total resources required to restructure a market or industry. The vast majority of the resources are coming from third parties that have been mobilized. Big opportunity, shaping strategies, restructure the market or industry, don't just take it as a given. So, in that context, the success of leverage hinges, first of all, on having a sense of opportunity. What's the big opportunity to mobilize people towards? That's where the look ahead comes into play. If you've identified a compelling opportunity out in the future, you're going to be more likely to mobilize the right participants and be able to identify who are the right participants to accelerate your movement towards that longer term opportunity, rather than just randomly going out and doing deals with whoever's out there. It's a much more systematic and structured approach to getting leverage. In this context, I'll just give a quick example of one successful shaper that we studied. It was an individual by the name of D. Hawk. In the United States, back in the 1950s, he was a mid-level executive in a small bank in the United States. And at the time, in the mid-1950s, credit cards were coming in as a new financial services product and getting adopted widely by customers. Big problem. Every bank was losing money on their credit card business. D. Hock came up with this idea of restructuring the credit card industry. At the time, every bank that issued a credit card did all of the processing of the credit cards in their own bank. He came up with the idea, what if we created a shared utility that all the banks could rely on for the back office processing so they could focus on the marketing and product innovation around the credit cards themselves. Long story short, he started a company called Visa. And he was very effective in looking around. In terms of really addressing this opportunity he saw, he was looking at what banks can I mobilize to really start to get critical mass in this new platform that I'm creating. And he actually adopted a somewhat counterintuitive approach, which was rather than go for the small banks that were having the most financial difficulties, his first target was the biggest bank in the United States, Bank of America. And he spent time understanding what the economics of Bank of America was and how to position the proposition and how to create a governance structure that would make Bank of America comfortable with handing off its back office processing to a third party. At the time, that was considered heresy in banking. You wanted everything to be in your own bank. But he was successful in making that proposition to Bank of America. He got them to sign on as the first partner in his new venture. That got the attention of all the other banks. Wait, the biggest bank in the United States has signed on to this new venture startup? Maybe we should pay attention. And then he went out to he identified 10 other banks that for a variety of reasons he felt would be most influential in terms of drawing more and more banks in. And again, spent a lot of time looking around to understand who those banks were, what their economics were, what the proposition would be that would get them to sign on. And in the end, accomplished extraordinary leverage. Visa, one of the leaders in the credit card industry today. And he did it by looking around. But he also did it by looking ahead and saying that the current structure of the credit card industry is not sustainable. Everybody's losing money. There's got to be a different way, an opportunity for everybody to make more money. And by looking ahead and then looking around, he was able to motivate and mobilize those third parties to come in and get extraordinary leverage for himself. And I should say too, when I talk about leverage, I encourage thinking more broadly about the kinds of relationships to build with these third parties. In my experience, most connections, in the ecosystems of today, most of the connections are very short-term transactional connections. You have something I need, I'll pay you for it, or we'll do some kind of exchange, mission accomplished, great. Very static view of leverage. In our experience, the most successful companies in pursuing leverage in the future are going to be those who find ways to build relationships where all the participants learn faster together. That's a very powerful form of leverage. Not only are you getting the leverage from network effects of more and more participants coming together, but every one of those participants is learning faster and getting to higher and higher levels of performance faster. That's the ultimate form of leverage. And so thinking about what are the relationships that are required to build learning at scale, not just with a few select partners, but with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and potentially even millions of partners. How can you learn faster together? So that's looking around and being very thoughtful about third parties and how to mobilize them in ways that can help you to create more value for yourself and for them. Now, let me get to the third form of expanding your horizons. This is looking within. And by this, I mean looking at what's inside people, motivating them to act. And in this context, I can see that many would say, well, wait a minute, the topic here is expanding horizons. You're telling us to shrink our horizons and look within. But at least in my experience, increasingly in a world of mounting pressure, we don't look within. We get caught up in all the events, the millions of events occurring daily, the torrent of data that's coming at us. We're consumed by looking outside, but just in the very narrow short term and the things that are hitting us directly. In that kind of world, we spend little time thinking about what's motivating people. And here I also want to be a bit challenging, because when I talk to executives about motivating people, the conversation quickly moves to, well, what kind of data can we provide? What kind of charts can we provide to persuade them to act in certain ways that are helpful to us? And I want to suggest that ultimately, it's not about data or beliefs, it's about emotions. Ultimately, the key driver, the key motivator of all of our actions is our emotions. In this context, I'll say that in most of my career, I've been a business strategist. And I've been focused on strategy as a key driver of value creation and performance improvement. Over the years, I've come to believe that it's much less about strategy and much more about psychology. That if we don't understand the emotions that are driving us, we're going to have a very hard time achieving what's possible. And in that context, again, I would say that in most of the business cultures that I'm familiar with, emotions are considered a distraction. You know, keep your emotions outside the conference room, let's get to business, versus really engaging and respecting that we all have emotions, and first of all, really exploring what are they at the moment, and then what could they be. And in that context, I would say that I travel around the world as part of my work, and I am more and more struck, especially over the past several years, that the dominant emotion that I'm encountering is fear. Everywhere, at the highest levels of the organization, at the lowest levels of the organization, out in communities, fear is the dominant emotion that I'm hearing and feeling. And again, at one level, I think that's totally understandable. In a world of mounting performance pressure, yeah, it's right to be afraid. You're being more and more pressured. What you thought you could count on, you no longer can count on. So fear is a very strong emotion. Now, I would say, too, that in many societies and many cultures, fear is a sign of weakness. So very few of us will get out there and express our fear, say, I'm afraid. Instead, we'll sit there and we'll get anxious, or we'll get angry. We'll manifest our fear in other emotions, but ultimately, again, at least my belief is the key driver of those emotions is fear. And until we recognize that as the dominant emotion and commit to find ways to evolve that from fear to hope and excitement, we're never going to address the exponential opportunities that are presented to us in society today. So I think that's a big challenge. And I would say that, again, one of my recent research topics is around the future of work. And in that broad domain of topics, some of the key themes have to do with lifelong learning and reskilling. We're all going to have to reskill continuously throughout our careers and learn constantly. Okay, everybody's talking about that. In my experience, no one is talking about what is going to motivate lifelong learning and reskilling. What's the motivation? I will tell you the unstated assumption, never fully brought out onto the table, but the unstated assumption is it's fear. If you don't learn, if you don't reskill, you're going to lose your job. You're going to be out of work. Get to work, learn, reskill. Okay, I will acknowledge that fear can be a driver of learning, but my belief is it is a very weak driver of learning. People will only do the minimum required, and reluctantly and resentfully if it's fear that's driving them. I think the big question here is, how do we get people to really seek out to learn and to reskill, to be excited about it, not to be resentful of it? And I will go back, one of the key aha moments for me, I spent time with Dee Hock, I mentioned, the founder of Visa. And in the conversation, I was talking about the elements of successful shaping strategies. And the way I was framing it was the key for a shaper is to maximize the perception of reward and minimize the perception of risk. And as I was going through this, he stopped me in mid-conversation. He said, "John, you're speaking like a business guy." He said, "What's really involved here is minimizing fear and maximizing hope." He brought to me, again, there were many experiences of this, but this was a key aha for me, was ultimately, if we don't focus on the emotions and find ways to address the emotions, we're going to find ourselves increasingly challenged. So in that context, one of the things we've been doing is looking in our research. We said if we're in a world of mounting performance pressure, let's go out and look at environments where there's sustained extreme performance improvement. And what can we learn from those environments? We ended up going out to some environments that were pretty distant from traditional business. We spent a lot of time looking at extreme sports, big wave surfing, extreme skiing. We went online into war game environments where the pressure is high and mounting. If you make the wrong move, you're going to die. That's a lot of pressure. And we studied what was going on in those environments and were there any common elements. And one of the things we found was that actually, in those environments, all the participants had a very specific form of passion. And I use this term somewhat reluctantly because passion is used so loosely. Everybody has a different meaning of it, and we all use the word, but mean different things. We ended up identifying a very specific form of passion that we found in all these participants in these environments. And it had three components to it. One component was, if you have this form, we called it the passion of the explorer. If you have the passion of the explorer, one key element is you have a long-term commitment to a domain. It's a fairly broad domain. It could be something like marketing or manufacturing or financial services, but it's a broad domain. You're committed to be in there, and not just be in there and not just learn about it, but to have an increasing impact in that domain. You're constantly driven to have more and more impact. The second element of this passion of the explorer is what we call a questing disposition. And in this context, the issue is, how do workers respond when confronted with an unexpected challenge in their work? You know, my experience is most workers try to avoid it. You know, their hope is that maybe if they ignore it, it'll go away. If they can't ignore it, they try to kludge some solution, but their key goal is to get back to the work that was assigned to them. They're resentful of that challenge. The people who have the passion of the explorer have a very different reaction to those unexpected challenges. They get excited. Wow, I never saw that before. How would I handle it? This is an opportunity to get to a higher level of impact. I'm excited. And actually, if they're not confronted with those unexpected challenges, they get bored. And they'll often move off and try to find another place where they can get more challenges that will help them to have more and more impact. So there's excitement about the challenge. And then the third element is what we call a connecting disposition. And in this context, the question is, when you're confronted with one of those challenges, what's your reaction? You know, many of us have the reaction of, well, I'll go off in a room somewhere and I'll try to figure it out and I'll come back with the answer. The passionate explorers, their first reaction is, who else can I connect with? Who can help me get to a better answer faster? Because my goal is to get more and more impact. How can I do that? By connecting with others. Passionate explorers are deeply connected because they're trying to address all these challenges. So these three elements come together, that long-term commitment to a domain, the questing disposition, the connecting disposition. And you bring those three together, and they're very powerful in driving learning. You want somebody who's going to learn faster? Find a passionate explorer. They are learning very fast, and they're excited about learning. And again, if they're not confronted with the opportunity to learn, they go back and get frustrated and bored and try to find someplace else where they can learn faster. So our belief is, if you're really looking at motivations and how to move people from fear to hope and excitement, it's how do you cultivate and bring out passion in the workers, in everyone in the organization? Because that will drive everyone to get to higher and higher impact and learn faster and overcome fear. I mean, I don't in any way want to suggest fear goes away. Passionate explorers feel fear, but they're so excited about the opportunity to have more impact, they will move forward. They'll address that fear and move forward. That's the opportunity, that's the need. The challenge is that if you look at, we did a research on the US workforce, maybe different in Brazil, but at least in the United States. We did a survey of the entire US workforce and asked how many people have passion in their work, passion to explore in their work. The results we got was roughly 13% of the US workforce has that form of passion. 87% do not. That's a huge challenge and opportunity. How do we cultivate and draw out that form of motivation? How do we look within and find the passion in people and draw it out? That's something that's I think, a big challenge in the way we run most of our organizations today. In that context, I'll just give one quick example of one action that we believe can help cultivate and draw out that form of passion, and it has to do with leadership. If you think about how we define strong leadership in most organizations today, the mark of a strong leader is someone who has the answer to all the questions. No matter what the question, you can count on the leader to have the answer. And by the way, if the leader doesn't have the answer, maybe it's time to get rid of the leader and find somebody who has the answers. Our belief is if we're really serious about looking within and driving this form of motivation around passion, the mark of a strong leader is the one who has the most powerful questions and who will freely admit they don't know the answer and ask for help. That can be very inspirational to people around you in terms of, oh my God, that's a really powerful question. If we could come up with an answer to that, that's exciting. But again, very different kind of culture and approach in terms of looking within and drawing out that kind of motivation within the workforce. But I will say too, in that context, that one of the reasons we're so focused on passion as a key motivator to drive learning and performance improvement is one of the elements in if you are in conversation with a passionate explorer, I can guarantee that within 30 minutes, that passionate explorer is talking about this really hard problem that they're trying to address and that they have no idea how to answer, and asking for help. Do you have any ideas or suggestions? What that does is build trust. A key element of trust is expressing vulnerability and asking for help. If you're not willing to express vulnerability, again, you may look like a really nice person, but I know I can't trust you. So asking for help becomes a key driver of building trust, and in a world of fear, that can be very helpful. So in broad strokes, I've talked about looking ahead, having a sense of direction, destination, looking around, finding ways to identify and mobilize more and more third parties to get more leverage, and looking within to get to the motivations that really matter, the emotions that are driving us, and recognizing that fear is not going to get us to where we need to be, and finding how to draw out other emotions, particularly passion, this passion of the explorer, that will help us to get to those opportunities. I will also say, though, that I want to emphasize, while I've talked about looking ahead, looking around, et cetera, it's not just about looking, it's about acting. If we don't act on what we see, we're not going to learn faster ourselves. We learn through action. We start by looking, but then acting and reflecting and learning from that action. That's a key requirement. I'll also say that while I've talked about this, looking ahead, looking around, looking within in organizational and business terms, I want to suggest that these expanding horizon approaches are very helpful at the level of individuals. Each of us, I think, needs to look ahead, zoom out. What's our 10 to 20-year opportunity that we're driving towards? And what are the actions we can take today? And who can we mobilize in terms of third parties that can help us get to that opportunity, address that opportunity faster? And how do we look within and really recognize our own emotions? Are we being driven by fear? And if we are, how can we shift that to find a passion that really excites us and motivates us to get better faster? So at the level of the individual and at the level of society, imagine what our societies would look like if we looked ahead, looked around, and looked within. We could accomplish amazing things. And these are all connected. I think by looking ahead, you can be more effective in mobilizing third parties, by looking ahead and identifying an inspiring opportunity, and then by looking around and mobilizing more third parties. That's a powerful way to overcome fear. If I can present you with a really inspiring opportunity and show that more and more people are joining in, that we're not alone, one of the big elements of fear is I'm alone. If we can bring people together to address inspiring opportunities, we can finally address those exponential opportunities that are part of this big shift that we're in, and move people from mounting performance pressure to exponentially expanding opportunity. Thank you very much.